to attract, retain, and develop diverse talent, which is key to creating an inclusive workplace. So hopefully, many of you already know me. I'm Sophie Tothill. I'm one of the engagement managers for CIPD in Northern England. And the CIPD in Northern England team's purpose, our kind of broader purpose, is to support CIPD's growth, reach and relevance in the north of England. So through the agenda for tonight's meeting, so we'll start by hearing from co-founder and director of She Leads for Legacy, Sharon Amezu. We will then hear from Lutfer Ali, who is the Senior Policy Advisor in Equality, Diversity, Inclusion and Transformation at the CIPD. We'll then be invited into breakout rooms for a facilitated discussion for around 20 minutes. And we will finish by coming back for a group discussion with Sharon and Lutfer. So it's going to be an amazing meeting. And I know that me and my team have been looking forward to this for quite a while now. So it's going to be great. Now, I'm going to hand over in a moment to Sharon. So the CIPD in Northern England have worked closely with Sharon over recent years to promote the importance of the EDI agenda, reaching out to our joint communities and networks across the region to enable positive action and provide resources, policies and content to educate and inform employers and the people profession. Now, Sharon and Daphne Dede Green, who is head of CIPD in Northern England, are both board members of the Greater Manchester Good Employment Charter, where they work to improve working practices across Greater Manchester and ensuring EDI is weaved through all aspects of good work. At CIPD, we believe that every person, in recognition and respect of their ethnicity and background, should be enabled and empowered to have equal access and outcomes throughout the employee life cycle. So employers who take action to ensure equal progression and participation in the workplace across people from all Black and ethnic minority backgrounds will benefit from attracting and retaining the best people, address skill shortages and improve performance in the process. So we are truly delighted to collaborate with She Leads for Legacy and Sharon, who is a recognised thought leader in this space. And an objective of today is to use the key themes that are raised to contribute to the wider conversation to drive this agenda forwards. So that's enough from me. Again, lovely to see you all, and I will hand over to Sharon now.
Thank you so much, Soph. So good evening to everyone. It's an absolute pleasure on my part to be spending this evening with you. But in the first instance, can I just say huge thanks to our partners at CIPD. As has been said by Soph, we have been journeying for some time, and it's a pleasure working with CIPD. It's a pleasure working with Soph directly for many years now, and indeed Daphne, who we've been working with for some time, and the Good Employment Charter, etc. So this conversation today has been very much the culmination of conversations that we have been having behind the scenes, as it were, thinking about the people group, the people leaders, talent managers, HR leads, HR directors, and how you go about doing the work that you do in a way that is able to ensure that everyone in your organization is able to thrive. And for you to do so in a way in which you also feel supported. So allow me please just to tell you a little bit about She Leads for Legacy. She Leads for Legacy came about as a result of conversations between myself and my daughter, who is also on this call, Afira Messu, and she is a co-director, co-founder of She Leads for Legacy. For 16 years, I was in practice as a criminal barrister. And when I entered the profession, it was over 6 years ago now. When I entered the profession, I describe it as a tale of two cities. I had incredible opportunities. I had great sponsors who came alongside me and opened doors and drew chairs up to tables that I might not otherwise have had access to. I had incredible people who were championing my success. But sitting alongside that, there were very real barriers. There were barriers that I'll explore shortly, but they were persistent, they were prevalent, and they were pervasive. And I recall entering the profession and being the only in so many rooms that I entered. Not least the first set of chambers that I joined, I was the only Black woman in the room. Fast forward 20 plus years, and my daughter herself is entering the legal profession. And we began to talk about our journeys, the extent to which there were similarities in our experiences, and where there might be divergence. What we recognized is that there were many similarities, but so often in the wrong places. We found that the issues in relation to discrimination, exclusion as Black women, the minoritized, marginalized Black women in those legal spaces were in fact far too pervasive, far too present, and far too much of an experience for her as it was for me, despite the fact that there was a 20 plus year age gap. So we set about trying to understand a bit more about why this was the situation and whether or not what we were experiencing were universal barriers that other Black women were experiencing as well. And we ran a series of focus groups to get to grips with, get beneath the surface of what was happening by way of experiences. We partnered with the University of Manchester, who commissioned a report with some PhD researchers to, again, understand. And through that piece of work, we began to get beneath the surface even more and understand there are real tangible barriers that Black women in particular are facing. And recognizing the intersection of those barriers was going to be crucial, it became clear, was going to be crucial to addressing those challenges. And also for us, it was so important for us not to have an echo chamber where we were simply rallying the voices of those who are experiencing discrimination, harassment, victimization, exclusion, and the like. But actually what we needed to do was work alongside allies, individuals and organizations who wanted to be agents of change, who wanted to be drivers of progress. And so She Leads for Legacy came about to convene a community of collective voices to drive the equalities and the equities agenda for Black women in the workplace. And why is it? Why is that necessary? Because the reality is, and I'm so grateful for Lutfer, who's here as well. Lutfer, so grateful for the conversation that we had leading up to this. And I just know that what you're going to bring in the next segment is going to be so full of information and data. So I don't propose to go into much data here. But for sure, there is significant data, statistics, evidence to support the contention that there are nuanced barriers for Black women in the workplace, that in order for us to overcome that and ensure that all of our talent thrives in the workplace, we're going to have to dig deeper and really develop our understanding of the nuance of those challenges. We know, for example, that according to a report by the London School of Economics, Black women are the least likely to be in the top 1% of earners, the least likely. We know that there are no Black female chief executives in FTSE 100 company boards. We know that Black women, when they seek to negotiate a salary in the workplace, research points to the fact that they are 16% less likely to achieve their desired outcome compared with our white male counterparts. There's also the issue as far as the cultural experiences that women face in the workplace, whether that be in relation to stereotyping, the old description of the woman, the Black woman who might be confident, who might articulate her views clearly, described as the ABW, the angry Black woman, and the extent to which that might cause a woman, a Black woman, not to be full-throated in her expression of herself because of the implications of that by way of stereotyping. We know of microaggressions that women and Black women face every day in the workplace, whether that be, for example, in relation to the food that they might bring in for lunch. It might be in relation to the color of their skin and the texture of their hair. In countless instances, there's been many books written and articles written about Black women having to say to colleagues, don't touch my hair. I certainly can attest to that personally, of people just reaching in and touching your hair and feeling the texture of your hair. There's also, very significantly, the question of career progression and the fact that Black female counterparts are not progressing at the scale and at the rate of our white male counterparts or even our white female counterparts. And this is really interesting because what we know, and I was recently on a panel where the question was raised as to whether or not the reason why we're perhaps not seeing the progression that we might want to see among Black female professionals is because of a lack of ambition. So there is just less of a desire to progress into senior leadership positions. Well, there was a report that was undertaken by what was then the Center for Talent Innovation. It's now titled COQUAL. And they looked at this question of ambition. And they found that Black women have a level of ambition towards senior leadership positions on a par with white male counterparts. So you have this dichotomy, really, between high levels of ambition, the desire to progress, but that not being experienced or manifest in the outcomes in the workplace. This is significant because it has an impact. It has an impact in relation to our profitability within our organizations. It has an impact in relation to the culture that we'll experience, our decision-making, our profitability, as I've mentioned. It has an impact in relation to our reputation, where we're not seeing diversity, where we're not seeing inclusion, where we're not seeing progression in the way in which we're well capable of doing so, then we're missing opportunities within our organizations. No doubt we're familiar with some of the research around this. There's the McKinsey report, there's PwC, there's Boston Consulting Group. Boston Consulting Group, for example, points out that where we have greater ethnic diversity on our teams making decisions, then we're 90% more innovative when it comes to driving progression in our organizations. McKinsey have said they've done research now over the last 10 years, and they've been looking at diversity of talent, both in relation to gender and in relation to ethnicity. And what they have found is that when you have greater gender representation at senior leadership level, then you have 21% greater profitability. When you layer that with ethnicity, it increases to 33%. So for all of us right now, and I have the great privilege and opportunity to work with many HR directors as a consultant. And one of the things that I hear coming up over and over again is this issue in relation to talent, attracting diverse talent, retaining diverse talent, capitalizing on that talent. And one thing is for sure, that in many ways, the more intentional we are about doing that, it's like a virtuous circle. The more we're intentional, the more people will be drawn to our organization, because they'll see that reflected in our policies and in our practices and in our culture. So then, I would like to just encourage us with what I describe as the 6 Bs before I hand over to Luffa to share his reflections. The 6 Bs to help us, first of all, to reflect on our role as HR leads in our organization, to facilitate and drive the equalities agenda and enable and support the progression of Black women in our organizations. Because the reality is that inclusion and diversity will not happen by happenstance. They will require a level of intention and action that perhaps we have not seen historically. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of the information that is currently in the public domain and in the public discourse around diversity and inclusion is not new. The reports that I've pointed to, as far as, for example, McKinsey is concerned, this has been out in our public discourse for some significant time. And so we have to then ask the question, why is there the gap between our knowledge and the outcomes? And I would say it's intention. It is the deliberate intention and the accountability that is required to drive this forward. So forgive me if I share some thoughts that are already well familiar with you. It will be a reminder for some, but for others, it will be just a reigniting, as it were, a refueling of the energy to get us focused on this so that we can ensure that we are HR leaders in organizations that have a competitive advantage and are doing the best that they can do for their people, for their communities, and for the planet. So the first B is to beware. It's to beware. Beware, first of all, of the illusion of meritocracy and the illusion of objectivity. Beware. And also beware of the false dichotomy between the place of work and our home life, society, and community. You see, so often when it comes to this, there is a belief that when our colleagues come through the portals of our building, then on some level, we assume that they shake off this identity and all that they are, and they come in, and essentially they ought to be a mold, a homogenous group who fall in line with the culture, as it were, within the organization, and essentially lose key aspects of their identity. But the reality is that the people who live in the communities, the people who live in wider society, who hear the narratives that take place in wider society, who hear narratives that take place in their communities, they are the people who come into our organizations. And so they are the people who are impacted by what happens in society. I recall, and many of us will recall, when George Floyd died and the impact that that had on the Black community in particular, and that experience of fatigue that many Black people experienced. And I remember hearing a story of a young woman, Black woman, who was so overwhelmed by the experience and the conversation, the discourse, the dialogue, and all of the stereotyping that took place amidst these conversations and at this time. And so she was feeling somewhat overwhelmed and in need of support. So she went to her head of HR to ask for some support, some steer, some direction, some conversation, some form of listening exercise, so that the experiences that she had had as a Black woman in the workplace could be heard and help shape policy in the organization. The response, unfortunately, that she received was, that's a mental health issue, and we have support, third-party support in place to support you with that. And they handed her the number for the counselling service that the organisation had commissioned. The understanding that the people who work in our organizations are from communities that are experiencing discrimination, experiencing harassment, experiencing inequalities is vitally important. And we saw this, didn't we? It really came into its own in COVID under lockdown. And we saw the disproportionate impact of COVID on racially minoritized communities. And the organizations said, the organizations who were best equipped to deal with that are the ones who paid attention to the nuance of the experiences of their Black and racially minoritized colleagues. So understanding, being aware of that false dichotomy. The second be aware is that illusion of meritocracy and objectivity that I mentioned. And that takes us into our second B, which is bias. All right, bias. And that's being conscious of, conscientizing ourselves around the fact that we, generally speaking, believe ourselves fundamentally at our core to be good people. No one would consciously say, I would set out to be discriminatory in my approach. No one would set out to be willfully harassing of other people. No one would willfully set out to exclude other people. And yet, when we look at the outcomes, they point to a particular picture. We see disproportionate outcomes. We see a lack of career progression in relation to our female counterparts and our Black female counterparts. So why is that? And what we have to point to is there's something going on in our decision-making structures. There's a really interesting report that was produced recently by the University of Manchester. It really struck me because it was about the judiciary. Now, the judiciary is essentially the institution which, by its very nature, ought to be objective. It ought to follow the rule of law, and the rule of law states that everyone is equal before the law. And yet, this piece of research, which was conducted just last year, research which spoke to 373 legal professionals. 57.4% of those were white professionals. 95% of those surveyed said that racial bias played some role in judicial decision-making in the judicial system, in the justice system. 63% said it played a significant role. What's really interesting is over half, 52%, had witnessed one or more judges acting in a racially biased way in their judicial rulings. Now, why is this significant? One might say, well, this is not HR leads, this is the judiciary. What it points to is that in an institution where it's overtly about fairness and justice, we see, in fact, them not honoring that. And that's because of often unconscious biases that sit beneath the surface in decision-making. So being aware, increasing our awareness of our individual biases, institutional biases, structural biases, where do they sit in our recruitment? Where do they sit in our decision-making, in our performance reviews, etc.? The next is buy-in. All right. Now, I know one of the biggest challenges that I hear from HR leads is how do we secure buy-in? How do we get everyone on board? And most importantly, senior leaders. All right. But that is one of the key things that I would encourage you as HR leads to focus on. Securing the buy-in of your HR, of your senior leaders within your organization is going to be a necessary driving force to move the agenda forward. The last but two is bolster support. There is a gold mine in your employee resource groups. They have information about what the needs are of the Black women in your workplace. So tap into them, into their stories, tap into their experiences, tap into their insights. Bolster through training and development you'll recall a recent report, well, perhaps about 2 years ago now, a report between CIPD and ACAS, Soft Skills for Hard Times. And one of the things that was highlighted in the report is how much people managers are a fulcrum of driving the equalities agenda and ensuring that there is a sense of inclusion and belonging in the workplace for all. So training and development, bolstering, support and commitment. The next is be brave. This work requires us to be courageous. In due course, Lufter will be exploring this idea of positive action. Well, that can often come up against some hiccups, some oppositional views. How do you stand and raise your head above the where there is resistance to your approach in driving this equalities agenda? How do you stand up and say, yes, we are going to be full-throated in our commitment to the progression of Black women? It's going to require you as HR leaders to be brave. And finally, begin. It might sound so obvious, but I see so many talk shops and echo chambers around this. And there is so much mining of information about the best approach and the best strategy. So many strategies I see in relation to diversity and inclusion, and yet not the mobilization. And so I encourage you, each of you, beware. Think of the barriers. Be aware of bias and buy-in. Seek to bolster support. Be brave and begin. Thank you very much for your attention. And now hand over to Lufber.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm just going to introduce Lutfer, if I may, but just to say a huge thank you, Sharon, for a very powerful opening to this meeting tonight. So I'd just like to introduce Lutfer, as I said. Lutfer is, in addition to his role in the CIPD, he is also a non-executive director for the Business Continuity Institute, the BCI. He is passionate about EDI being a catalyst for transformational change to enable growth, resilience, improvement, and equality of outcomes for all people. So he has a career spanning over 3 decades in leadership positions in the public, private, and third sector. Lutfer has been championing and speaking out for the delivery of social justice, anti-poverty, EDI, and sustainability in organisations across the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors. He has enabled many organisations to become employers and services providers of first choice and best in class. And prior to joining the CIPD, Lutfer worked in a range of roles, including Director of Business Development and EDI for the Tribal Group PLC, Head of EDI for the Department of Health, Head of Policy and EDI for the London Fire and Emergency Planning Authority, Advisor to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Advisor to the National College of School Leadership, and Associate to the National College of Policing. In his role as Assistant Chief Executive for Tower Hamlets Council, he led the overall transformation programme in reshaping the organisation's workforce, securing vital partnerships, improving service delivery, and achieving over 30% efficiency savings while protecting frontline services. Lutfer has served on several landmark judicial inquiries and government task forces, including the Saeed Mubarak inquiry, the Prime Minister's Prevent Task Force, and the International Ministerial Working Group on Illegal Working. So a fantastic person to be speaking to us this evening. So I will now hand over to you, Lutfer.
Thanks, Sophie. Thank you very much to everyone joining us this evening. I know you've taken time out from extremely sort of busy days, and you want to spend a little bit of time with your families. An extremely huge thanks to Sharon and Afia, both of you, for sharing your stories, and through Sharon, you've shared Afia's story, and certainly the work that you're doing with She Leads for Legacy. It's just incredible. So just want to sort of extend this wonderful sort of gratitude to you. Let me see if I can upload some slides to share. Can everyone see this?
If you We can just see your notes on the next page. Are you able? Is that the presentation?
That's the present. Gosh, it's gone to the second slide. Is this there, or are you just still seeing the notes?
Well, we can still see the notes. Would you like one of our team to share, look for, and we
yes,
can share
please.
our screen? Okay. Do you want to make a start, and our team will share the slides in the background?
So what I'd really like to sort of start off with, just give you an idea about the areas that I'd like to cover, in terms of the thoughts. So one area would be the qualities of approach that we should really be looking to take around pursuing equality, diversity, inclusion in our workplace, and with a focus on Black women's equality, of course, in the workplace. Another issue is we want to sort of explore understanding the changing language landscape and how that impacts on the conversations that we can have with Black people, Black women in the workplace. And how can we position Black women's equality as being good for everyone? Because this continuous minutiae focus on different aspects of the protected characteristics can often seem quite overwhelming for HR professionals and managers in an organization. But if we can look at Black women's equality as being good for everyone, then that sort of draws a particular focus on it being beneficial for the whole of the organization. Also, how do we try and understand what our starting point should be is another area worthwhile exploring. I think we're there with the slides. Okay.
Sorry about that.
There we are. And then what are the sort of key components? And I think Sharon sort of highlighted quite a few of them, but I'll go into a little bit more sort of detail about what an integrated Black women's equality, diversity and inclusion strategy looks like, and how that then links into developing a culture of Black women's equality in the organization. And that's the sort of impression of the kind of areas that I'd like to share with you today, and hopefully with a view to having a really rich discussion and conversation afterwards. Next slide, please. We can move on. So looking at the qualities of approach, I think, does it matter, gender equality, women's equality? Because we've heard these terms being talked about. And I'd like to sort of say that it's important that we focus. So gender equality relates to both men equality and women's equality, whereas women's equality only relates to women's issues. So I think sometimes people confuse the two when they talk about gender equality. And I'd go as far as to say that it should be really women's pay gap reporting rather than gender pay gap reporting. I think that really matters. And you'll see that theme running throughout the conversation and the ideas and thoughts being shared with you today about the precision of why language is really important in relation to equality, diversity, inclusion, communication. And in terms of the strategies that we develop, it makes a huge difference. If we take, for example, our anti-sexism approach versus a women's equality approach, an anti-racism approach versus a race equality approach, while both being important, there are some interesting differences. And what are those differences? So if we take anti-sexism versus anti-racism, it's something that is opposed to either sexism or racism and focuses mainly on taking a legal approach, tackling discrimination. And it is underpinned by being a deficit model. It's about looking at the negative aspects of racism and sexism and not necessarily focusing on what the opportunities might be. Whereas women's equality and race equality focuses on equality of access, equality of opportunity, treatment, outcomes, and most importantly, what's the impact? And includes tackling racism, tackling discrimination, barriers, biases, as Sharon sort of talked about in detail, and marginalization, both past, present, and potential, which I'll touch on as to how we can address through positive action measures. And then, of course, it talks about the benefits approach, which includes moral, social, legal, and most importantly, the business benefits and the benefits to society. Now, if we take the moral, social, legal, all those are still business benefits to an organization. If an organization is behaving immorally, having poor social responsibility, and has unlawful practices, it's still bad for business and it's bad for society. So you could clump all of this under the benefits model of business benefits and societal benefits. So I hope that's giving you a quick impression about why qualities of approach to women's equality, race equality is very, very important. I know there are lots of organizations that are pursuing an anti-sexism approach and an anti-racism approach. That's fine, that's important, but insofar as they recognize that the outcome that we're seeking to achieve is equality of outcomes around Black women's equality in the workplace. If this is forgotten in terms of what the outcome that one is seeking to achieve by an anti-racism and anti-sexism approach, then I think those organizations will be stuck on a deficit model. We can move on to the next slide, please. So I can't control it from here. So coming on to sort of spending a couple of minutes on looking at why terminology and inclusive language is important. I think many of you will have come across a whole plethora of words that are now being used to describe this space around historically what was regarded as equal opportunities. And I think there's been certainly since my sort of conversations with CIPD and some organizations with the conflation of the word equality with equity, which I'll touch on a little bit later. But we carried out a little bit, we did a survey of around 6,000 organizations very, very recently through CIPD. YouGov carried out this survey, and we asked employers, which words are you using to describe the work around this space? And topmost within that, the 4 top words that are being used is equality, fairness, inclusion, diversity. Equity came, fairly low down the list of what people are using. Now, why are people using equity in the United Kingdom? It's something that actually US corporates are using, and the word equity has a slightly different meaning in the United States than it does in the United Kingdom. Equality is important for the United Kingdom because we are conforming and compliant to the Equalities Act 2010. Historically, the Equalities Act is called the Equality and Human Rights Act. So everything that we do here in the United Kingdom is based on human rights principles, and that's a very important distinction from equity. In the simplest form, the distinction between the two things is that equity is what you do, is the remedial actions that you take to achieve equality of outcomes. So that's why that important distinction is important, and why we need to stick to the language of equality and not have that be synonymous with anything else. Now, all these other issues are important, all those other words and values, social justice, issues of inclusion, diversity, and I'll talk about why inclusion and diversity doesn't necessarily deliver equality later on in a couple of examples going on. Now, we've also got sort of other words that are currently being used: authentic selves, recognition of and valuing of vulnerability in the workplace, psychological safety, celebration of Black women's achievements on the positive side, and on the negative side, how power and privilege really affects all of this. So fundamentally, what we're talking about is a rebalancing of the power relationships between people at work. So that means any actions that you take to address structural and systemic discrimination, which interestingly, the Sewell report, which is the sort of report that the government commissioned on looking at ethnic disparities in the United Kingdom, unfortunately decided that systemic racism and structural racism wasn't particularly prominent in organizations. Well, you'd think differently if you looked at the Metropolitan Police Service and the NHS, which I'll touch on in a little bit later. So there's an opportunity missed, but we know that structural racism and discrimination exists in organization. It's because it's there. And of course, something that's not talked about particularly well is colorism for Black women. And that's a very, very important issue. Now, all of this is important, and I've just sort of put a few of those words there. And I think we need to sort of evolve our language and understanding so that we can have those conversations with Black women in the workplace and Black people in the workplace. And that requires us to get comfortable with having uncomfortable conversations with people about this. And I don't know whether any of you have read Rennie Edo-Lodge's book as to why I'm no longer speaking to white people about race. But it's a very, very interesting book to read, and she describes in great detail and great passion as to what her difficulties have been in terms of discussing race issues, because some white people simply do not possess the language or the necessary innate understanding of how to engage and talk to Black people. And that's really important that we seek to do that. Next slide, please. So as HR professionals, managers in an organization, we need to sort of start, we need to have a starting point. And I think Sharon sort of made a clear indication of that in her presentation. So what are the barriers and blockages, and how do we identify that? Well, the go-to issue is, what's the data telling us? What are the representational issues? At a very, very basic level, what does the staff workforce look like in terms of the information for people accessing different careers, different jobs? What are the turnouts like? Who's getting through? Who's not getting through? What are the blockages? Beyond this, what are the internal staff surveys telling us? So all that's the rich amount of data and evidence that needs to be gathered to sort of try and establish what the starting line is, the baselining of this. Some sophisticated organizations, more complex organizations will look at other organizations and try and compare themselves. And of course, you look at data against as the sort of quantitative part of it, but also what are people feeling within the organization? What do focus group research suggests, in terms of your organizational staff networks, if you have them, what are people saying, and how is that qualitative information coming together to supplement the hard data in terms of what the current equality situation is in the organization? A couple of examples are pay gap. What is the pay gap? And specifically, what's the pay gap for Black women? Because Sharon specifically highlighted there are some specific compounded issues that Black women experience that may be apart from Black men, or for that matter, white women and the general sort of workforce population. Issues of underrepresentation, feedback, qualitative and quantitative, as I've met, and clearly what are the outcomes and impact of any previous initiatives that have taken place around equalities within the organization. When we understand the picture of what is happening, we can then look at what targeted interventions are necessary to take. So that's in a way the starting point. This is what Sharon is talking about when she's saying you need to begin the journey somewhere. Next slide, please. So quick national snapshot. First of all, sort of looking at sort of women generally, 4 in 10 women experienced some form of unwanted sexual behavior. 7 in 10 disabled women said they had been sexually harassed. 1 in 9 mothers, 11%, reported that they were either dismissed, made compulsorily redundant, or treated poorly, and which led to them having to leave the organization. There's still, after a number of years of gender pay gap reporting, a 17.3% gap. And most importantly, what does the government do when discrimination laws aren't followed? And many have described the Equality and Human Rights Commission as being an organization without teeth. They're not able to enforce, the many of the sort of shortcomings and many of the non-compliance of lots and lots of organizations. And that's sort of illustrated by the research that I referred to earlier that the CIPD carried out. So that's a big issue and a big area. If there's no enforcement of very, very good equalities legislation, then organizations are getting away with a lot of things that they ought to be doing. For Black women, and this is the little bit that you'll find expanding on a little bit of what Sharon had highlighted. Job insecurity, 1 in 8 Black women compared to men. Low pay, 3 out of 5. And underemployment, 1 in 8. Next slide, please. This is an example of a colleague who said, "I drive a nice car," and she was said, "Are you a drug dealer? Because how else could you afford a car like this?" When she reported the incident, she was told it was probably in jest. And this is the HR director that said this to her because of the area of the country we live in, which is predominantly white. Now, the TUC's data suggests that more than 120,000 workers quit jobs because of racism in 2020, 2021, when this study was carried out. 1 in 4 Black and ethnic minority workers face racist jokes, and underreporting is still a big issue. 1 in 4 and underreporting is still a big issue. Can you imagine if there wasn't underreporting taking place? And racism is described as a pandemic or epidemic not just in the NHS, but you can look at the MPS and fire services, both organisations which I've worked for and with. Next slide, please. So some interesting stats on Black women's inequalities, where they're compounded. So stereotyping and prejudices about race, colorism, gender and class, impacts on mental and physical health. We've seen the example of the disproportionate impact of COVID-19. The cumulative impact of discrimination can cost Black women's lives. Okay. Unfair treatment, almost half, 45% of Black women say they've been singled out for harder or unpopular tasks. Discrimination, almost a third, 31% of Black women reported being unfairly passed over or denied promotion. This rose from nearly half for disabled Black women, and that's where the intersectional component comes in. Okay, Black women comprise of the range of diversity of protected characteristics that the Equalities Act talks about. And that intersectional lens is really quite vital. Now, racism, more than 1 in 3, 34% of Black women have experienced racist jokes and so-called banter at work, and 30% have experienced verbal abuse in the workplace. Next slide, please. I've referenced these organizations, the NHS, the Met, and Tesla and SpaceX. Let's talk about NHS and the Met. Both organizations, actually all 4 organizations, claim to have representational diversity. Okay, NHS, as we know, in some organizations has over 70% women workforce. And in some NHS trusts, there are over 45 to almost 50% Black and ethnic minority workers in the organization. Yet when you look at senior level representation, it's not particularly good. And when you look at the sort of feedback from staff surveys consistently in those organizations, you will find that Black staff are consistently being discriminated against, and there's a disproportionate level of discrimination and application of HR procedures against Black staff. And the data around dissatisfaction and how staff are being treated and the experience of staff in these organizations are overwhelming. I mean, I don't need to make the point, you've seen in the front on our TVs, on news reporting, what the NHS has gone through, and most importantly, the Met Police being on under special measures for sexism, racism, and LGBT discrimination. Now, Tesla has over 900 Black and ethnic minority staff taking class law action against them, and equally SpaceX, which is another company owned by Elon Musk, which has claimed, and very much like greenwashing their company, has been also EDI washing their presentation. And you haven't heard that term, or maybe you have. EDI washing is very much like greenwashing, to present to the outside world that we're a very diverse and inclusion-friendly employer, and therefore more people join. But when they actually join, the true reality of organization people experience in terms of the inequalities that exist in those organizations. That said, I'll move on. So the key point here is representational diversity does not necessarily deliver equality of outcome. And the biggest example in this is probably about William Ellison. I don't know whether any of you know from the sort of 17th, 18th century, a former Black slave who ended up being one of the biggest slave owners. A former Black slave ended up being one of the biggest slave owners and became one of the most successful slave owners in all of the United States, from South Carolina. Now, the point here is, just because a person from a Black and ethnic background or a Black woman reaches a senior position does not necessarily, and we've seen this with Suella Braverman and other sort of senior politicians from an ethnic minority background, does not necessarily mean that they will be a proponent of championing equalities for Black people. Okay, quite the reverse in some instances, as in the case of William Ellison, whose harshest slavery tactics led to other white slave owners coming to him for advice, no less. So following the construct that has been set for them, the white man construct of success, doesn't necessarily lead to equality of outcomes for Black people. That said, moving on, how do we engage and work with and have conversations with Black people at work? How do you see the pace of change in your organization to equality and inclusion of outcomes for Black people? It's a question that we need to ask. It's a conversational issue. What are the reflections on Black people as leaders or role models in our organizations? Are Black people required to adhere to fit into the Western white constructs of success, as I've just sort of mentioned in relation to, people who reach positions of senior positions? And sometimes those people are used as vehicles to promote the same inequalities and same racism just because they have, they're of a particular color. And do we have the language to have the conversations around race in the workplace, which is about continuous and ongoing learning about, what Black colleagues are experiencing in the workplace, and for us developing, our own sort of skill sets to be able to have those conversations. More importantly, how compassionate and empathetic are our approaches in having those conversations? Next slide, please. So this is a little diagram what Dr. Barbara Banda calls how Black people navigate the workplace, and she uses this diagrammatic approach called SCAN. Okay, so situation, confirm, analyze, next. So in terms of the situation, what happened? So many instances where where are you from? No, where are you really from? Okay, so we've seen this, with the Queen's aide or Queen's senior person that sort of looks after her. And there was a sort of party at Buckingham Palace when, some Black women were attending, and one of the Black women was continuously and persistently asked, where are you really from? And the person persisted in saying, I'm from Hackney. But where the person was trying to go with that question was trying to identify where they're actually from in terms of ethnic heritage. But the Black woman in question did not want to answer that question because she was really from Hackney. She was born there, she was raised there, so it was an important sort of issue for her. I'm often asked, your English is very, very good. I happen to be, have been born here. So these are elements of microaggressions, and it's, subtle discrimination. Now, the person might not be aware, and this is the sort of bias that Sharon was sort of alluding to earlier, in terms of unconscious bias. This is the situation. In each situation, we as Black people have to constantly assess, what actually happened there and what is going on there. And then we have to sort of think about and confirm, did I really hear that person saying that or asking that question or referring to me in the way that they're referred to? And that's that confirmation that takes place. These decisions are made, because we've gotten used to it over the years. These are made in immediate, within nanoseconds of those taking place. And then we begin to analyze, does it really matter at this stage that person made that comment? Do I want to have that battle right now? Do I want to raise this as an issue? And how should I respond if I do? Should I leave it for another time? Should I say, well, actually, this is an inappropriate way of you're referencing me or talking to me? Or should I raise it more formally? Now, this can get quite onerous on Black people because when it happens on a daily basis, and for most, that it does. And it's subtle, it's consistent, it's persistent, and it can wear away at Black people in the workplace because it's happening all the time. Now, of course, people, we build up resilience in order to deal with it. But the impact of that on a Black woman, for example, who also has challenges socially, who also has family challenges, who also has other wider sort of issues impacting on her, will lead to, as I mentioned earlier, greater and greater sort of challenges on her mental health and her physical health. And we've seen that play out. And I worked with a couple of mental health institutions about 6 or 7 months ago, where the number of Black people going through the mental health system was far disproportionate to white people. And also the application of medication and physical restraint on Black people was far greater than white people. In fact, it was triple that which is applied to white people. So these are all indications, and we know from research and studies that Black people are suffering greater levels of mental health, not just only in the workplace, but also in society. So how people navigate the work life, Black people have a significant compounded impact of all the sort of issues of discrimination bias that's directed at them, whether it's knowing or unwitting. Next slide, please. So here we look at how we can embed Black women's equality into the wider equality, diversity, inclusion strategy, subject to an organisation having one or seeking to develop one. Now, you'll recall I mentioned that looking at Black women's equality should be looked at with a view to actually being good for everybody. If you make changes for one particular equality protected characteristic, and if you do it through an intersectional lens, it will be good for everybody else, because any change that you make in this area is beneficial for everyone, all people, including men in an organization. And here we look at clarifying and looking at women's equality. What's the organization's values? What's the vision, mission? What are the business plans? And have they considered women's equality, Black women's equality in particular, in terms of those values? And what are the sort of nuanced changes, minor changes that can be made within the value sets that will seem all-embracing, all-inclusive, and Black women can identify with? Does the vision have the same approach? Does the mission have the same approach? And most importantly, does the business plan integrate an EDI priorities? And within the EDI priorities, are there specific initiatives and programs that are targeted at Black women to address the inequalities that Black women face in the workplace? When one is putting together an equality strategy for women in the workplace and improving Black women's equality, it should include, it must include, and it must be co-created with Black women in the organization. If it isn't, a big, huge opportunity is being missed out, and ownership will be lacking, and it being informed by real experiences and lived experience of Black women will be missed out, and that's really important. That's not necessarily a stage 2 event. That's effectively that should be done at stage 1 level. The next element is ensuring sustainability and visible leadership, so that there should be specific priorities of how ownership at the senior level, at board level, at governance level, and that should include accountability. At the end of the day, it's the board, the chief executive, and the senior leadership team that are responsible for delivering the equalities action plans, the equality, diversity, inclusion plan, and any specific priorities that are identified for Black women. If they don't take responsibility, and responsibility for delivery is left with line managers and other system leaders, then it's going to be of limited impact. The ultimate responsibility should rest with the senior leadership people. And that's where I think very often organizations fail. They pay lip service, and I'll show some data and stats that sort of try and reinforce that a little bit later. Critically, women's equality proofing people management policies and procedures. What I mean by that is, and this goes on, for example, looking at the language that's in adverts, for example, or job descriptions, or person specifications, is it inadvertently excluding Black women from applying? Not just sort of language, but what are the systemic sort of barriers that exist in terms of practicing? What do interview panels look like? Have interview panels been trained for equality, diversity, inclusion? What are the questions and how are they designed? There's a whole range of things that are involved in equality proofing people management policies. The whole raft of issues need to be looked at, including how disciplinary procedures are being applied in the organization. Sharon mentioned the idea that an assertive Black woman is considered as aggressive, or someone who's overbearing. Well, this is part of this issue that if the training is there and people have been made aware of different ways that people are, people being authentic selves. Someone who has autism may not necessarily make eye contact, or is not wants a specific place for working in each day. So that might come across, or they may continuously be asking certain questions that you might find rather ill-conceived. And similarly, there are specific ways in which Black people and Black women operate. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're being aggressive or they're being overbearing. So those kind of cultural training elements, which you call cultural competence issues, need also to be factored into equality, diversity, inclusion training policies and procedures. I'll draw on positive action in a little bit more detail in the next slide. But sharing power and connecting Black women by creating safe spaces for them, so equality resource groups, but not just creating them and letting them be, but resourcing them effectively so that they can become valuable tools for the organization. So if necessary, creating specific Black women spaces where they can be given resources to self-support, but also to be a commentary and an advisor to the rest of the organization in terms of developing priorities, policies, and business plan as a consultative mechanism. But this is about having a place on the top table. This isn't just about consultation. So are Black women represented on the board, and how is that taking place? So if there isn't a senior Black person in the organization at director level with the appropriate skill sets of understanding equality issues, just having a Black person on the board without having the necessary equality skill sets and understanding these issues, is just a tick in the box. We need to make sure that all the people on the board are trained with equality, diversity, inclusion, understanding and awareness, but also then having an equalities champion there that role models Black women's representation on the board as well. So that's that power sharing bit that we're talking about here. And then communicating Black women's equality messages consistently, including taking a zero tolerance approach to any issues of discrimination in the workplace. Communicating progress, achievements, their stories, and that's important in terms of culture change that needs to take effect in the organization. Next slide, please.
Look, Fer, I'm just going to jump in here because we're running a little bit over time and it's time to go into the breakout discussion. So I do apologise, I really do, for cutting you short because this has been fascinating. Is it okay to share your slide deck with the group after this meeting?
Absolutely.